In early August 1977, the leader of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, called an emergency meeting with senior officials from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. An unprecedented incident had taken place in Yerevan. A large sum of money had been stolen from the vault of the state bank. Brezhnev placed the investigation under his personal supervision and demanded daily updates on its progress. At the time, Armenia was part of the Soviet Union, and the crimes of this scale had never before occurred in the country. It was a serious blow to the credibility of the nation's financial system. The robbery took place on the night of Friday, August 5, 1977, but bank employees didn't discover the missing money until Monday morning, when they returned after the weekend. By the time investigators arrived, they immediately understood the trial had already gone cold. The criminals had nearly 2 full days to disappear without a trace. Even the method of entry wasn't immediately clear. The evidence left behind at the scene puzzled investigators. Among the items found were a hand drill, crowbar, empty bottles, and a child's umbrella. A rather unusual set of tools for breaking into a bank vault, wouldn't you agree? None of the items found were rare or hard to obtain. They were all freely sold in stores. The criminals had also left no fingerprints on any of them, so the investigators had little reason to expect any major breakthroughs from this evidence. What truly astonished everyone, however, was the amount of money stolen. Nearly 1.5 million Soviet rubles, roughly equivalent to about $1.3 million today. It was an enormous sum. To understand just how serious that amount of money was at the time, it would have been enough to buy around 15 apartments in decent neighborhoods. Of course, these calculations are purely theoretical. In the Soviet Union, it was practically impossible to openly spend such an amount of money. Questions about where it came from would arise immediately. This led investigators to wonder what were the thieves planning to do with the money. One theory even suggested that the funds might have been stolen to finance a possible coup. As a result, massive inspections and checks began across the entire republic. The State Bank of Armenia was located in an old building, and its layout did not allow money to be stored in the basement. As a result, the vault was placed on the second floor. A steel door led inside, and both the walls and the floor were heavily reinforced. Directly above the vault was a staff lounge that was undergoing renovation at the time. During the repairs, workers had temporarily disabled the alarm system. On top of that, due to their negligence, the window bar had been removed. This created the perfect opportunity for someone to get closer to the vault. The robbers entered the bank building through those unprotected windows. Once inside the staff lounge, they drilled a small hole in the floor. The room was located directly above the vault. First, they pushed a children's umbrella through the hole. The idea was simple. When they began dismantling the floor, the pieces would fall silently into the umbrella's canopy. The bottles of water were used to cool the drill. After widening the hole enough, the criminals lowered themselves down on a rope, straight into the vault, where hundreds of millions of Soviet rubles were stacked on the shelves. And then they did exactly what they had come there to do. A special task force of detectives were formed to investigate this massive crime. The investigators from Moscow carefully reviewed all the collected evidence once again and noticed one important detail. The robbers had taken only bundles of 100 ruble banknotes. And not just any banknotes, they were brand new bills from the AI series, which had not yet entered circulation anywhere in the country. They had only recently been printed at the state facility and were about to be released for public use. These were completely new bills, not only from the same AI series, but with the serial numbers running consecutively. In other words, no one else could possibly have them, and that became the investigators' first real lead. It was obvious that the criminals were thinking purely mathematically. The larger the denomination, the bigger the whole. Carrying 1.5 million rubles in large bills was easier than transporting the same amount in smaller ones. But in reality, this turns out to be their biggest mistake. The robbers had no idea that these were bills would provide a way to trace them once they were put into circulation. The Minister of Internal Affairs of the Soviet Union appealed to the head of state, Leonid Brezhnev, with a proposal to temporarily suspend the circulation of the AI series banknotes. After weighing the pros and cons, Brezhnev issued the corresponding order. The new 100 ruble bills were to be temporarily frozen. State cash offices and stores were given a strict instruction to report immediately if any customers attempt to pay with a fresh 100 rubles note. As paradoxical as it may sound, a nationwide surveillance operation was set up to track anyone using these bills, a task far from simple if you try to imagine it. The investigators could only wait for the thieves to use their loot and attempt to pay with the new 100 ruble bills. Their strategy proved correct. Soon, they received a tip. The account of the restaurant in the capital had deposited a week's earning at the bank, which included stolen bills from the Yerevan bank. But there was little reason to celebrate. Restaurant employees had not remembered any details about the restaurant patrons who had paid with 100 ruble notes. Another dead end. The people who paid with the stolen 100 ruble banknotes from the AI series acted confidently and calmly. They booked their visits in advance, chose the best tables and restaurants, ordered expensive food and drinks, and even requested music from the orchestra. But the most surprising part, none of the restaurant staff could remember what they looked like. For the robbers, it was pure luck, but for the investigators, a real problem. The Kremlin was furious. The best specialists were brought in to investigate the case, but the result was zero. There were still no leads. The detectives had no choice but to wait. Sooner or later, the criminals would try to use the stolen money again. And then, the money resurfaced in the capital. This time, the elusive criminals decided to buy government bonds. But here they made a mistake. A big one. An inconspicuous man in a black cap walked into a bank and asked to purchase bonds for a large sum. He even managed to hand the money over to the cashier. But the cashier didn't have enough bonds available. She asked him to wait and stepped away. And at that moment, everything went wrong. The man panicked. He thought she had gone to call the police. He suddenly turned around and ran away, leaving money right there on the counter. The cashier immediately reported the suspicious man to the police and even helped create a composite sketch. The suspect, more a failed bond buyer than anything else, was quickly detained. He turns out to be an ordinary taxi driver. After a polite interrogation, the driver began to explain where the money had come from. This led investigators to real culprits, two cousins, Nikolai Kalashchan and Felix Kalachyan. Nikolai already had a criminal past, According to some reports, he left home at a young age and had connections with gypsy groups. Felix, on the other hand, was a family man, a wife, 2 children. He worked as a janitor, earning very little, but he was naturally flexible and even held the title of Candidate of Masters of Sports in gymnastics. It was Felix who carried out the key part of the heist. He leaped from the neighbor's building onto the bank's roof, drilled a hole above the wall, and made his way inside. From there, he took about 1.5 million rubles, in all in large 100-ruble banknotes, the highest denomination at the time. Ironically, there were the banknotes became their downfall. If Felix had taken smaller bills, they might never have been caught. There were no other real leads, but 100-ruble notes were really seen in circulation. They were mostly kept inside bank vaults. That detail gave investigators the break they needed. The court sentenced both brothers to the ultimate punishment, execution. However, the death penalty for 2 young men, one of whom was a father of 2, seemed excessive to the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Armenian USSR. He filed a pardon request to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, where the argument was considered reasonable and approved. The life-saving pardon was sent from Moscow to Yerevan, but it arrived too late. The car carrying the urgent documents got stuck on the road. By the time the paper finally reached the prison, it was already over. Nikolai and Felix had been executed the day before.